67 years ago, in the early hours of February 2, 1959, 9 members of a hiking expedition died in the Northern Urals. This is the last known photo of them alive. But even that photograph carries a mystery of its own. There are nearly 80 theories about what happened that night. But the deeper you go into this case, the more you realize just how many strange details and contradiction it contains. A tent slashed open from the inside, footprints leading away into the darkness, bodies found in different places with different injuries, mysterious traces of radiation on their clothing. Before making this video, I spent a huge amount of time studying this case. I am a native Russian speaker. That means I could go directly to the original investigative documents, the original diaries, the original witnesses' testimonies, not translations, not summaries, not other people's interpretations of what the sources said. Some of what you're about to hear has never appeared in an English language video before, not because it was hidden, but because most people covering this case simply cannot access the sources. Today, I want to share those overlooked facts, those untranslated details, and the many theories surrounding one of the most mysterious cases in Soviet history. We are going to reconstruct the timeline day by day. We will get to know each member of the group. We will examine the key evidence and break down the major inconsistencies in the official investigation, the ones that make the official explanation so hard to accept. And of course, we will look at the most well-known theories, from an avalanche to atomic espionage. You're watching KISS. We bring you a different angle on the stories you care about. If you enjoy deep, well-researched history, subscribe to the channel, like the video, share it with someone who loves history. It will help us to make more interesting videos just for you. To understand this tragedy, you first have to understand the world these young people lived in. The late 1950s in the Soviet Union were a very particular moment in history. It was the period known as the thaw. The country was only beginning to recover from the horrors of war. The wounds were still fresh. Almost every family had lost someone, but hope was beginning to return. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched the world's first artificial satellite. People had begun to believe that almost anything was possible. And in that atmosphere, young people began heading into the mountains, into taiga, into places where were no roads, no warm buildings, no safety nets. Hiking and expedition travel became enormously popular. This was not casual recreation. It was a whole philosophy. In a country where almost every part of life was organized and supervised, the wilderness offered something rare, a place where you had to rely entirely on yourself and the people beside you, where the only authority was the mountain and the cold. This culture was serious. There were official ranks, classifications, and awards. Beginners started with easier roads and worked their way up through 3 difficulty categories. At that time, the 3rd category was the highest. To earn it, you had to complete at least 300 kilometers on skis through rough, trackless terrain, climb mountain peaks, and prove both your endurance and your ability to function as a team in harsh conditions. Reaching that level meant something. It had to be earned. But in the Soviet Union, you could not simply grab a backpack and disappear into the forest. Every expedition had to be registered, approved by a sports club, and documented in the official road book. And there was one more unwritten rule. The trip had to be tied to some meaningful public occasion, something that gave it an official purpose in the eyes of the state. That was exactly the kind of reason Dyatlov's group found. On January 27, 1959, the 21st Congress of the Communist Party was opening, a major national event. A group from the Ural Polytechnic Institute dedicated their expedition to that Congress. What did it mean in practice? Years later, the sole survivor, Yuri Yudin, explained it with striking honesty. When asked why they had dedicated the trip to the party congress, he said,
"Well, we needed food, smoked meat, sausage. The country had just come through the war. Things were economically tight. And to get those products, you had to tie your trip to something important. The party congress was perfect. So that's what we did."
That small story says a lot about the Soviet Union. Ideology on the surface, pragmatism underneath. Official status did not just provide ideological cover, it also helped them to get supplies, and it kept the authorities on their side. The group's leader was Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old student with 9 expeditions already behind him, including trips of the highest difficulty category. The road he proposed was officially approved by the City Road Commission. This was not some improvised outing. It was a fully sanctioned expedition with all the proper documents. One more detail is worth remembering. During the exact days when Dyatlov's group was already out in the wilderness, Sverdlovsk was hosting an international speed skating competition. Foreign athletes, foreign press, the Soviet Union presenting itself to the world and wanting everything to look flawless. Keep that in mind. When we get to the authorities' response to the group's disappearance, it will matter more than you might expect. The group was assembled, the road was approved, and the trip was dedicated to the party congress. But before we follow them into the wilderness, you need to know who they were. There were 10 of them. 9 went into the taiga and never came back. 1 survived, and for him, that may have been harder than death. Before we follow them on their journey, we need to meet each of them, because behind every line in the official reports, behind every photograph, there were real people with their own personalities, their own lives, and their own dreams. Igor Dyatlov, 23 years old, the leader of the group, a 5th-year student in the radio engineering department at the Ural Polytechnic Institute, later UP. Igor was not just an experienced hiker, but at that point he was already one of the strongest and most capable people in the group. He had 9 expeditions behind him, including 2 of the highest difficulty category, one to the Eastern Sayan Mountains in 1956 and another to the subpolar Urals in 1958. People who had traveled with him remember one thing in particular. Dyatlov had an extraordinary visual memory. On that subpolar Urals trip, military geologists refused to hand over their maps to the group. They would only show them. Igor took one look, memorized what he saw, sketched it out later from memory, and then, when the group was flown into the area by plane, checked the terrain from above and led everyone along the road. At the same time, Igor was not reckless. People who knew him described him as thoughtful, even slow when it came to making decisions. He disliked rushing and always tried to weigh everything carefully. But once a decision had been made, he stood by it firmly. Maybe that combination, caution and firmness, was exactly what made him the kind of leader people were willing to follow. He was also a talented engineer. In the 2nd year in the institute, he built a shortwave radio transmitter and took it with him on earlier expeditions. He also designed the lightweight camping stove the group used on this trip. This time, though, the radio was left behind. It was simply too heavy to carry. Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22 years old, a student at the same radio engineering department as Dyatlov, 1 year below him. If Igor was the brain of the group, Zina was its heart. She was considered the main organizer of the UP hiking club. Energetic, full of life, the kind of person who made everyone around her want to get up and do something. In her first year alone, she organized a major ski trip for beginners and then several more after that. She already had dozens of expeditions behind her in the Urals and the Altai, including some very demanding ones. During one of those trips, tragedy nearly struck. Zina was bitten by a viper. For several days, she was on the edge of life and death. She was quite literally pulled back from the brink. And yet, just 1 year later, she was leading another expedition. That says a great deal about her character. In the group, Zina was more than just a friend and fellow hiker. She had once been in a relationship with Yuri Doroshenko, and she had taken the breakup really hard. In letters to a friend before the trip, she admitted it would be so difficult for her because Doroshenko was coming too. Yuri Doroshenko, 21 years old, a student in the Faculty of Hoisting and Transport Machinery. Yuri was an experienced hiker, brave and decisive. One story remembered by his friends says a lot about him. During a trip in the Sion Mountains, while the group was setting up camp, a large brown bear walked into the clearing. It was Doroshenko's shout that warned everyone. But instead of running, he grabbed a geologist's hammer and charged at the animal without hesitating for a second. The bear backed off and disappeared into the trees. Yuri returned to the campfire looking like a man who had just won a battle. And in a way, he had. He was also the one Zina had once been involved with. The fact that they would be on this trip together gave the journey an emotional weight from the very beginning. Lyudmila Dubinina, 20 years old, the youngest member of the group, a student in the engineering economics department. Luda was not just the girl in a group of a young men. She was a strong personality in her own right. She sang beautifully and loved photography. She had already gone through her own ordeal. At 18, during one of her expeditions, someone accidentally shot her in the leg. The wound was really serious. For several days, the others had to carry her until they reached a hospital. The doctor saved her leg, but the scar stayed with her for life. And just a year later, Lyudmila was already leading a second-category hiking trip in the Northern Urals. Rustem Slobodin, 23 years old, a graduate of UP, working as an engineer at a closed facility. Rustem was a real athlete. He ran long distances, trained in boxing, and held sports rankings in skiing and volleyball. At the same time, he was calm, kind, and dependable, one of those people others naturally leaned on. The group valued him for exactly that. His name sounded a bit unusual for Russian, but both of his parents were Russians. It was simply a time when such names had become really fashionable. Georgy Krivanishchenko, 23 years old. Everyone called him Yura. A UP graduate, he worked as an engineer at a plant in the closed city of Chelyabinsk 40. That fact would later become the basis for many different theories. Far too many mysteries surrounded that place. But for now, it is enough to say that Yura was Dyatlov's closest friend. They had gone on expeditions together, and they often visited each other's at home. Within the group, Yura was the joker, the entertainer, the one who could lift everyone's spirit when things got hard. Alexander Kalivatov, 25 years old, a fourth-year student in the Physics and Technology department at UP. Before Alexander entered the institute, something in his life took an unusual turn. In 1953, he finished technical school and was sent to Moscow for work placement. He spent 3 years there as a senior laboratory assistant at one of the research institutes, one that fell under the ministry overseeing the Soviet nuclear industry. Then he returned to Sverdlovsk and enrolled as a full-time student. For now, that is simply a fact worth remembering. In the group, Sasha was quiet, private, and very responsible. He kept a diary that he carefully hid from others, and he smoked an old-fashioned pipe. Nikolai Thibaut Brignol, 24 years old, a graduate of the civil engineering department at UP, working as a construction foreman in Sverdlovsk. His last name was French. Nikolai's great-grandfather had emigrated from France to the Russian Empire back in the 19th century. His father's fate, however, was tragic. An engineer arrested and sent to a camp during Stalin's rule. Nikolai himself was born in a camp where his mother was being held. And yet, despite that beginning, he grew into an energetic, resourceful, and friendly man. He liked drawing and had a real interest in photography. Semyon Zolotaryov, 37 years old, the oldest member of the group, and in many ways the most mysterious. He stood apart from the others immediately because of his age, his background, and the way he carried himself. He asked people to call him Sasha, even though his passport said Semyon. Semyon had gone through the entire war. He was born in 1921, and of the men born that year who were sent to the front, only 3% survived. Zolotaryov did not just survive. He fought through the whole war and came home with 4 military decorations, including the Order of the Red Star. After the war, he studied at the Physical Culture Institute and eventually became a hiking instructor. Shortly before this expedition, he left his job at a tourist base and asked to join Dyatlov's group at the last moment. No one in the group really knew him. No one had hiked with him before. Before he left, he said something strange, a remark nobody paid much attention to at that time. We will come back to it later. And then there was the 10th member, the one who stayed alive. Yuri Yudin, 21 years old, a fourth-year student in the Engineering and Economics department at UP. Yura was kind, dependable, and an experienced hiker, fully part of the group, fully committed to the trip. We will talk later about what stopped him, but for now, all you need to know is this. He was there at the beginning, standing on the platform at Sverdlovsk station with the others. He had every intention of going all the way, but he did not. There they are, all 10 of them, young, talented, with very different lives, but united by one shared love, the mountains, taiga, and the world of expeditions. They were not just a random group of people, they were a team, and now it is time to follow them. January 23, 1959. Winter Sverdlovsk is seeing them off. At the station, not only Dyatlov's group has gathered, but another hiking team as well, Yuri Blinov group, heading out on a different road. Together, the two groups boarded the same train to Serov. From that moment on, the documented story of the expedition begins, a story we can trace through diaries, photographs, and eyewitnesses' accounts. More than 2 weeks of travel lie ahead. Behind them are proved roads, signed paperwork, and a promise to return. But for now, they are simply young people on a train singing songs, joking, making plans. In the first few days, 2 small incidents took place. On their own, they seem minor, but in light of what happened later, they feel strangely significant. The first happened in the town of Serov. The tourists were not allowed to spend the night at the station. It was freezing outside, it was night, and the officials would not budge. So Krivonishenko, the group's joker and entertainer, decided to handle its own way. He put on a hat, grabbed a walking stick, and started begging for alms outside the closed station doors, singing at the top of his voice. The local police were not impressed. They took him to the station, but the group had documents proving they were an official expedition dedicated to the party congress, and after a short explanation, Yura was released. They found another place to sleep and moved on. The second incident happened on the train itself. A drunk man accused the group of stealing his bottle of vodka and started a fight. At the next stop, they handed him over to a patrol. Again, their official papers saved them. Without that status, both situations could have ended very differently. But Dyatlov group was part of the system, and the system protected them. On January 26, the group reached Ivdel, a small city about 340 kilometers north of Sverdlovsk, and the last real settlement on their road. Beyond it stretched the endless Ural taiga. From Ivdel, they caught a ride to a logging settlement known as the 41st Quarter. In practical terms, this was the edge of the world. The local forestry chief gave them a horse and a driver to help carry their gear. One detail is worth noting: the driver was a former prisoner. It is a reminder that the area around them was dotted with gulags camps, and meeting ex-convicts was simply part of life there. Later, that detail would feed one of the theories about the group's death. Their backpacks and skis were loaded into the sled, and they moved north. On January 27th, they reached the abandoned settlement of the second northern mine. It had once been a living place, around 30 houses, people, noise. By 1959, all of it was gone. Only one house still had a roof. That was where they spent the night. 9 young people deep in the taiga, in an empty house the forest was slowly reclaiming, in temperatures close to -30. They warmed themselves by the stove, cooked dinner, laughed together. They had no idea this was their last night anywhere near civilization. On the morning of January 28, something happened that would change everything for one of them. Yudin's leg had been hurting for several days. His sciatic nerve had become inflamed. He had hoped it would ease once he got moving on skis. Instead, with every kilometer, it got worse. He tried not to show it, but Dyatlov's experienced eye noticed that his friend was struggling. In the end, Yudin made the only sensible decision. He had to return back. For Yura, it felt like a crushing blow. He felt almost like a traitor, even though there was nothing he could have done differently. As they said goodbye, Dyatlov mentioned almost in passing that the group would most likely be delayed by a day or two because of the weather. That detail matters. As early as January 28, Dyatlov was already unsure they would stay on schedule. The conditions were harder than expected. He knew it, and he said so. Yudin was left standing there alone. He watched as his 9 friends put on their skis and moved away into the taiga. They turned and waved to him. He waved back. Then they disappeared behind the trees. It was the last time he ever saw them. After the group said goodbye to Yudin, their journey continued. From that point on, we can only follow what happened through the small fragments, diary entries and rolls of film. Looking at those photographs today, you see people smiling, joking, pushing through hardship and making plans. People who have no idea what is coming. Before we go further, it is worth pausing to understand what a trip like this meant in 1959. They had none of the gear we take for granted today. No modern waterproof clothing, no lightweight insulation. Their skis were heavy wooden boards. Their tents were made of canvas that let the wind straight through. Their clothes were simple, cotton and wool. To stay warm, they had to keep moving. At night, the only option was to climb into their sleeping bags, wearing every piece of clothing they owned. That's why, when the bodies were later found, many of them were wearing multiple pairs of socks and several sweaters at once. It was not unusual, it was the only way to survive. On January 28, the group moved upstream along the Lozva River. On January 29 and 30, they continued, first along the frozen Lozva, then turning toward the Aspia River. It was remote, empty country, taiga, mountains, snow. They navigated by map and compass, following an old trail used for centuries by local Mansi hunters. On January 29, Zina Kolmogorova wrote in her diary, Mansi traveled along the Ospia. You can see tracks, not just a trail. There are often signs along the trail. I wonder what they are writing. The Mansi were there. That is not speculation, but a fact recorded in her own handwriting. Their tracks, their trail, their mark and carved into the trees. On the next page of her diary, Zina carefully copied some of those symbols down. Most look like ordinary trail marks left by hunters, but a few are harder to explain. On January 30th, the group planned to build a labaz, a supply cache where hikers leave part of their food and heavy gear before the climb, so they can travel lighter. But they never got to it that day. Evening came too quickly, or the place did not feel right. On January 31st, they made their first attempt to cross the pass. Dyatlov himself wrote the last entry in the group diary that day. His words paint the picture better than any description could.
Wind is western, warm, piercing, with speed like the jet from airplanes at takeoff. Fern, open spaces. I can't even think of setting up a laybaz here. It's nearly 4. Have to start looking for a place to pitch the tent. We go south in the Auspia Valley.
That was what they were dealing with. Not a gentle slope and a light breeze, but a wind that hit like a jet engine on an exposed icy surface with nowhere to shelter. Evening was closing in. They made the only sensible choice: head back down into the forest where there was protection from the wind and wood for fire. The night of January 31st passed without incident. On the morning of February 1st, they finally built the cache. It was a hollow in the snow, covered with the branches and marked with a pair of skis stuck upright so they could find it again on the way back. Inside, they left part of their food, some spare gear, and anything too heavy to carry up the slope. The plan was simple: climb Mount Atarten, then return here on the way back. After lunch, around 3 p.m., they set out again. The original plan was to cross the pass that day and descend into the Lozva Valley, ready to push toward Atarten the next morning. But things did not go according to plan. They climbed into the slope of Khalachachal. Why Dyatlov decided to pitch the tent there instead of descending back into the forest, no one can say for certain. February daylight is short. It gets dark by 4:30 or 5 p.m. Going back down would have meant losing elevation they would have to regain the next morning. Whatever his reasoning, by evening the tent was standing on the eastern slope of Khalachachal, roughly 300 meters below the summit. 2 photographs are believed to be the last ones ever taken of the group. They show people digging into the snow, leveling the ground, and setting up a camp. In the first picture, everyone has their back to the camera. In the second, one of the hikers has turned around and is looking into the lens. The estimated time is around 5 p.m. After that, not a single diary entry, not a single photograph. Only night, only cold, and whatever happened next. February 12, 1959, the settlement of Vizhai. This was the final point on Dyatlov's road, the place where the group was supposed to arrive and send a telegram to Sverdlovsk. Everything is fine, we are coming back. But February 12th passed, then 13th, then 14th. No telegram came. In Sverdlovsk, nobody rushed to sound the alarm, and there were reasons for that. The winter break at the Ural Polytechnic Institute was still going on. The dormitories were nearly empty. Most students had gone home. And any experienced hiker knows that delays happen. Bad weather, a harder road than expected, someone's fallen ill. There are many reasons a group might fall behind by a day or two, or even more. The head of the sports club, Lev Gardo, told anyone who asked that Dyatlov had sent a telegram saying the group was delayed. That was not true, but Gardo was most likely hoping they would show up at any moment and the problem would disappear on its own. The one person who could have cleared things up, Yuri Yudin, who had returned to Sverdlovsk at the beginning of February, stayed Quiet. He was simply waiting for his friends to come back. He did not know the group had failed to check in, and he did not go to the sports club, perhaps because of a quiet feeling of a guilt for not having gone all the way with them. Only the families could not afford to wait. Igor Dyatlov's sister, Rustem Slobodin's father, and the relatives of Lyudmila Dubinina and Alexander Kalivatov called the sports club and the institute party office every single day, demanding answers. They were told the same thing every time. Wait, everything is fine. But a mother's and father's heart are not so easily reassured. On February 16th, someone finally managed to reach Vizhai by phone. The answer was short and terrifying. Dyatlov Group had never arrived, not on the 12th and not later. That was the moment the situation became impossible to ignore. But even then, several more days passed before anything real was done. To understand why, you have to remember what kind of country this was. In the Soviet Union in 1959, any emergency automatically became a potential political problem. And in those exact days, Sverdlovsk was hosting an international speed skating competition. Remember that detail? Foreign athletes, foreign press, a showcase of Soviet success. News that a group of students had gone missing in the Urals could have brought exactly the kind of attention the authorities did not want, so they chose to wait a little longer. Only on February 19th, when pressure from the families had become impossible to ignore, was Colonel Georgy Artyukov sent to Ivdel. He was the head of the training department of the UP military faculty, a war veteran, a tough and decisive man, and he was now expected to take charge of the search. On February 20, an emergency meeting was held at the institute. The decision was made. Search groups would be formed from volunteers, students, hikers, climbers, anyone who knew the mountains and could travel on skis. Expert mountaineers were flown in from Moscow. Interior Ministry troops were deployed with dog handlers, sappers, and radio operators. The Mansi hunters who knew every slope and every trail in those mountains volunteered to help as well. And then the first serious problem became clear. The exact road Dyatlov's group had taken was missing. According to the rules, every expedition was supposed to leave a detailed road plan with the sports club, control points, dates, backup options, but in Dyatlov's case, that plan was nowhere to be found. Whether he had simply forgotten to submit it or whether the document had vanished somewhere inside the Soviet bureaucratic machine, no one could say. The road had to be reconstructed piece by piece from memory, from conversations with friends, from old notes and photographs. That took another week. On February 22nd, 3 student search teams were reviewed at the institute and sent out. These were not professional rescuers. They were students, friends of the missing hikers, fellow members of the hiking club. They were not going out to recover bodies. They were going out hoping to find them alive. Boris Slobodin's group headed toward Mount Atarten, the final destination on Dyatlov planned road. If the group had reached the summit, they were expected to leave a note there. Finding it would tell the searchers which direction they had gone next. But when Slobodin's group was dropped off by a helicopter, a navigational error put them down on the wrong peak. They had to cover extra distance on skis with heavy packs across rough ground before they finally reached Atarten on February 24th. They climbed to the summit. They checked every rock. Nothing, no trail marker, no note, no sign that anyone had ever been there. Dyatlov group had never reached Atarten, which meant the tragedy had happened earlier, somewhere along the road before the summit. Slobodin decided to descend into Lazva Valley and search every section of the road. On February 25th, moving along the Ospia River, his group came across old ski tracks in the snow. In that wilderness, in that time of the year, they could only belong to one group of people. The tracks led uphill toward the pass. Slobodin ordered his group to split up. February 26, 1959. The morning was cold but clear. Boris Slobodin and Mikhail Sharavin, together with their Mansi guide Ivan Pashin, climbed toward the pass between Khalatchakhl and the unnamed height 880. At one point, Pashin, already tired, sat down at the snow and told the younger men to go on without him. So Slobodin and Sharavin continued alone. And then Sharavin noticed something, a dark shape on the northern slope of Khalatchakhl, something unnatural, something that stood out against the perfect white of the snow. They looked more closely. There was no doubt. It was a tent. They ran toward it. Slobodin recognized it immediately. He had helped sew it together himself several years earlier. Two ordinary four-person tents joined into one large one big enough for the whole group. There was no other tent like it anywhere in those mountains. It stood on the eastern slope, its entrance facing south, its northern side buried under a hard wind-packed drift. Nearby, two pairs of skis stuck upright out of the snow. A bedsheet hung from the entrance. An ice axe lay on the ground, and from it hung Igor's Dyatlov storm jacket. On top of the tent was a flashlight. Slobodin picked it up and flicked the switch almost without thinking. It turned on. A flashlight that had supposedly been lying there for almost a month in freezing cold under snow and wind, and it still worked. Remember that detail, it will matter later. They looked inside. No one, not alive, not dead, just belongings. 9 backpacks, clothes, jackets, sweaters, trousers, boots, shoes, socks, food, cameras, a flask of alcohol, money, documents, diaries. Everything was still there. Nothing had been taken. It did not look like chaos. It looked like things left behind in hurry. The most important detail, though, would only become clear during the forensic examination. On the side of the tent facing downhill, there were several cuts, 3 long ones, 31, 42, and 89 centimeters. Experts would later confirm they had been made from the inside with a knife. The people in that tent had cut their way out. But why? The entrance was right there. It closed with buttons, and 2 of the lowest ones were already undone. They could have simply gone out the normal way, so why take a knife to the canvas? That question would hang in the air for decades. Slobodin and Sharavin did not stay alone. The weather was turning and they needed to get back to camp. They took the most important items: the ice axe, the flashlight, Dyatlov's jacket, 3 cameras, and the flask, and headed back. At 6 p.m., radio operator sent a message to the search headquarters in Ivdel. Tent of Igor Dyatlov group found on the eastern slope of height 1079. No people in the tent. At headquarters, the news was met with something close to relief. The logic was simple if fragile. If they were not in the tent, they must still be alive somewhere. Maybe they had set up another camp nearby. Maybe they had gone to find help. None of the searchers, not even the most experienced among them, wanted to believe the worst. That evening, someone suggested to toast to the missing hikers. The Mansi guide, Ivan Pashin, sitting quietly by the fire, answered, "You'd do better to drink to their souls." The students were offended. The words seemed wrong, even cruel. They still had hope. By morning, they would understand that Pashin, a man who had grown up in those mountains and knew exactly what they could do to people, had understood the truth before any of them were ready to face it. The morning of February 27th came cold and quiet. The searchers still believed the group had retreated into the forest to wait out the weather and would be found alive. The hope was thin, but it was still there. Yuri and Mikhail Sharavin headed toward the valley of the Lozva River, searching the area carefully as they moved. Then their attention was drawn to a large setter standing on the rise above the stream. They made their way toward it. When they were still 10 or 15 meters away, they saw two bodies lying in the snow. Whatever hope remained collapsed in that moment. The bodies lay near the remains of a fire. Around them were blackened branches, burned logs, and pieces of wood that had only fully caught. The snow was trampled down. Someone had fought hard to stay warm here. The dead were later identified as Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivanishchenko. Doroshenko was lying face down, his arms tucked under his body. He was dressed in a short-sleeved shirt and underwear, no shoes, just 2 socks. Scattered around him were small personal items and scraps of clothing, some of them partly burned. During the autopsy, forensic expert Boris Возрожденный found a large burn on the right side of Doroshenko's head and another on his foot. His body was covered in scrapes and bruises. His ears, nose, and lips were bloodied. And there was one detail that would later become one of the most debated in the entire case. A gray fluid had come from his mouth. In forensic medicine, that can be a sign of acute pulmonary edema caused by severe trauma to the chest. Doroshenko was young, fit, and healthy. Something like that was hard to explain away. The official cause of death was listed as hypothermia. Krivanishchenko was lying on his back with one sock on, his head thrown back, and his lips pressed together. Burns marked his foot, his legs, and both hands. His body was covered in cuts, bruises, and scratches. But the detail that stopped people cold was this. In his mouth, they found a bitten-off piece of his own finger. He had bitten into it, either to stop himself from screaming or to keep himself from losing consciousness. His official cause of death was also hypothermia. On the setter itself, at the height of 4 to 5 meters, branches had been broken off. There were traces of blood on the trunk. Around the area were stumps from about 15 young fir trees that had been cut down, even though there was plenty of dry wood nearby. Someone had gone to great effort gathering living branches instead of using what was already there. Fir bedding had clearly been prepared, but the bedding itself was gone. Experts would later conclude that both bodies had been moved after death. Another member of the group has most likely found them frozen, laid them out with some care, and taken some of their clothing in a desperate attempt to stay warm. As the search continued, a third body was found about 300 meters uphill from the setter. It was Igor Dyatlov. He was lying on his back, his head pointing toward the tent, one hand wrapped around the trunk of a young birch tree. He was better dressed than the two by the fire: ski trousers, thermal underwear, a sweater, a shirt, and a fur vest. But he had no hat and no shoes. On his right foot was a wool sock, on his left, a cotton sock. There were scrapes and bruises on his ankles, cuts and bruises on his face, and one missing front tooth. The forensic expert noted that they were kind of injuries often seen after a fight. His fists were clenched. On his wrist was a watch. It had stopped at 5:31. The official cause of death was hypothermia. That same evening, about 500 meters farther up the slope, a search dog found a fourth body buried under about 10 centimeters of snow. It was Zinaida Kolmogorova. She was face down, her arms bent beneath her, her legs half bent, her right leg drawn up. She was dressed more warmly than the others: 2 hats, 2 sweaters, layers underneath, and ski trousers. No shoes, just wool socks. She was pointing uphill, toward the tent. She had been trying to get back. At least, that's what it looked like. There was blood on her face, bruises on her hands, a long bruise across her lower back. Officially, hypothermia. 4 people. all on the same line running from the setter to the tent, 2 near the fire, nearly undressed, 2 on a slope, closed but without shoes, all moving or having moved in the same direction. Something had driven them out of the tent and stopped them from getting back to it. 5 members of the group were still missing. On March 1, 1959, new people arrived at the pass. Among them was Lev Ivanov, the Sverdlovsk regional prosecutor criminalist, who would go on to lead the investigation. That same day, the tent and everything found inside it were loaded into a helicopter and flown to Ivdel. Later, many researchers would criticize that decision. The scene had been examined only superficially, without proper documentation. In the rush, in the cold and wind, the belongings were simply collected and taken away. What evidence may have been lost in the process, no one can say. In Ivdel, the tent was laid out inside the local police building. A seamstress took one look at it and said with confidence, the cuts had been made from the inside. Later, that conclusion would be officially confirmed, but on March 1st, the main task was still the search. 5 members of the group had still not been found. On March 2nd, the searchers found the cache in the valley of the Aspia River. The food and the gear the group had left behind before the climb still untouched. The discovery mattered. If the group had simply retreated into the forest, they would almost certainly have gone back for it. But they had not, which meant whatever happened had unfolded fast. On March 4th, army sappers arrived with the long metal probes and began working across the slope in a line, pushing them into the snow every meter, searching square by square. The work was exhausting, up to 10,000 probes in a single day. The snow was dense and deep. Again and again, the probes went in and found nothing. Then, on March 5th, one of them struck something soft. Carefully, centimeter by centimeter, the searchers cleared the snow. Beneath 15 to 20 centimeters of snow, a body appeared. It was Rustem Slobodin. He was lying about 180 meters from where Dyatlov had been found, on the same straight line running from the tent to the setter. Face down, his left arm stretched out to the side, his right hand clenched into a fist, his right leg slightly drawn up. The snow beneath his body was melted a little. The detail mattered. When he fell, his body still held heat. He had not died instantly. He had lain there alive for some time before the cold finally took him. Slobodin was dressed more warmly than the others. A shirt, a sweater, worn trousers with another pair over them, a ski cap on his head. On his right foot was a felt boot worn over 4 pairs of socks. The matching boot was later found back in the tent. His left foot had nothing on it at all. On his left wrist was a watch. It had stopped at 8:45. In his pockets were his passport, 310 rubles, a knife, a pencil, a comb, and a box of matches. Everything was still with him. Robbery was clearly not part of this story. The body was recovered and on March 6 flown by helicopter to Ivdel. That same day, the local civil registry officially registered the death of 5 of the hikers: Dyatlov, Krivanishchenko, Doroshenko, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin. On all 5 death certificates, the same cause of death was listed: hypothermia during a hiking expedition. But for forensic experts, the real work was only beginning. The autopsy was performed by Boris Возрожденный, the same forensic expert who had examined the other 4. On external examination, there were only scratches and bruises, but when the skull was opened, a fracture about 6 centimeters long was found in the left frontal temporal region. A closed injury, the skin was intact, but the bone had cracked. An injury like that could cause brief loss of consciousness, internal bleeding, and serious problems with coordination. Возрожденный concluded that it had likely accelerated the freezing process, but that the direct cause of death was still hypothermia. How had Slobodin received that fracture? There were no rocks on that slope, only snow. A blow from a ski pole? Possibly, but who could have struck him and why? And then there were his hands. His fists were clenched, his knuckles scraped and bruised, the kind of marks left by someone throwing punches. On his left shin were two parallel abrasions, like the marks from a trip or a sweep. The implication was hard to ignore. Before he died, Rustem Slobodin had been in a fight. After March 5th, the active phase of the surge slowed. The snow around the Setter and the ravine was simply too deep. The probes went all the way in without reaching the bottom. Search leader Yevgeny Maslennikov made the decision to scale back the effort and wait for spring, when the snow would begin to melt and reveal what was underneath. Some searchers returned to Sverdlovsk, others rotated in and out. The work continued quietly through March and April, but the pass gave nothing more up. The people who had already seen the bodies could not forget what they had seen. The cuts in the tent, the strange positions of the dead, the mismatched socks, the bitten off finger, the crack in Slobodin's skull, none of it fit the idea that the group had simply frozen to death. The real answer were still out there, buried under 4 meters of snow in the ravine by the stream. And what would be found there when the snow finally melted would change everything. April was coming to an end. The snow on the slopes had begun to melt, revealing what had been hidden all winter. Near the Setter, where Krivonishenko and Doroshenko had been found, broken fir branches started to appear through the snow. They stretched off toward the southwest, forming something like a trail. The searchers who had been left to watch the area noticed it and reported it to headquarters. On May 5th, a search group led by the Mansi hunter Stepan Kurikov began to examine the ravine the trail of branches seemed to lead into. Right at the mouth of the ravine, frozen into the snow, they found a pair of black athletic pants. The pants were badly burned and the right leg had been crudely cut off. Nearby lay the left half of the woman's wool sweater, also cut in two. The sweater was identified as belonging to Lyudmila Dubinina. At that point, it became clear the bodies had to be somewhere nearby. The ravine was deep, and the snow there reached as much as 4 meters. They had to dig for a long time, inch by inch, and when they finally broke through, the scene in front of them was horrifying. The first body they uncovered was Lyudmila Dubinina. She was on her knees, facing the slope, her chest resting against a ledge of the stream bank. Her body was lying in water because beneath the snow a fast-running stream had continued to flow all winter without freezing solid. Nearby, just a few meters away, lay 3 men: Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolevatov, and Nikolai Thibault-Brignol. Thibault lay slightly apart, while Zolotaryov and Kolevatov were beside each other, almost as if embracing chest to back. The condition of the bodies shocked even the most experienced rescuers. Lyudmila Dubinina was dressed in several layers: a short shirt, a longer shirt, and 2 sweaters. One of the sweaters, brown in color, would later be identified as Krivonishenko's. She had taken it from her already dead friend in an attempt to keep warm. She was wearing warm trousers with another pair on top, badly burned and torn apart. On her head was a small cap. On her feet were 2 pairs of warm socks. A third sock, unmatched, lay nearby. But the most horrifying thing was her face. The soft tissue around her lips and mouth was gone, exposing her teeth and upper jaw. Soft tissue was also missing from other parts of her face and in places the cheekbone could be seen. Both of her eyes were missing, and most difficult to explain of all, her tongue was completely gone. But even that was not the end of it. During the autopsy, forensic expert Возрожденный found a fracture of the hyoid bone. This is a small bone at the base of the tongue, one that almost never breaks on its own. It is too protected and too rarely exposed to direct impact. In forensic medicine, a broken hyoid bone is considered a classic sign of a strangulation by hands or by a ligature. It is exactly the kind of fracture that can happen when the throat is compressed. Blood was also found in her stomach, which meant that the injuries, including the loss of her tongue and the fracture of the hyoid bone, had happened while she was still alive. Let that sink in for a moment. Lyudmila Dubinina was still alive while this was happening. Semyon Zolotaryov was dressed better than the others. He was wearing 3 pairs of trousers, a long jacket over a sweater, 2 hats, a scarf, and boots. But his injuries were no less terrible. 5 ribs were broken, and his chest had been crushed into what doctors call a flail chest, a condition in which part of the rib cage is no longer connected properly to the rest of the chest. Soft tissue was missing from his left eyebrow area, exposing the bone beneath. At the back of his head was a deep laceration, also down to the bone. Like Dubinina, both of his eyes were missing. Alexander Kalivatov lay beside Zolotaryov. He was wearing a jacket and trousers, but the clothes showed multiple tears and burn marks. His eyebrows were gone, and bone could seen where they should have been. His nose was broken, his neck was deformed, possibly broken as well. Behind his right ear was a deep wound. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol was dressed warmly too. He wore a canvas-lined fur cap and a knitted wool hat tied tightly under the chin, but his head had suffered terrible damage. His skull had been crushed inward on right side of the temple and parietal area, shattered into multiple fragments with extensive bleeding beneath the membranes of the brain. There were bruises on his face and a large hematoma on his right forearm. Near the bodies, the searchers found a platform made from 14 young fir trees and 1 birch. The trees had been cut with a knife and laid down in several layers. On top of the platform were items of clothing, a sweater, a sleeveless vest, and a warm trousers, and among those items was a soldier's foot wrap made from overcoat cloth, with a brown strip of braid at the end. This was already the second foot wrap found in the connection with the Dyatlov group. Yuri Yudin had seen the first one among the belongings brought back from the tent and stated with complete confidence that none of the group had owned anything like it. So where had they come from? That question still has no answer. On May 9th, forensic expert Boris Возрожденный began the autopsies of the final 4 bodies. Even for him, the findings were shocking. Lyudmila Dubinina had 10 broken ribs, symmetrically on both sides. There was extensive bleeding into the right atrium of the heart. Her hyoid bone was fractured. Her eyes and tongue were missing. The injuries pointed to the force of a massive impact, the kind seen in a car crash. Death came 10 to 20 minutes after the injury. Semyon Zolotaryov had 5 broken ribs and severe internal bleeding. His eyes were missing. There was a wound in the back of his head. The injuries had been sustained while he was still alive. According to the expert, Zolotaryov could have survived for several hours after receiving them. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had a depressed skull fracture, multiple bone fragments, and bleeding into the brain. It was the kind of injury that does not allow for long survival, but Thibault may still have remained conscious for 2 to 3 hours. He could not have moved on his own. He would have had to be carried or dragged. Alexander Kolevatov had a broken nose, a deformed neck, and a wound behind the ear. His official cause of death was listed as hypothermia, but the nature of his injuries strongly suggested that he too had been subjected to violence. Возрожденный noted the strange pattern of the injuries. Dubinina and Zolotaryov had almost perfectly symmetrical rib fractures, as if something large and flat had crushed their chests. Thibault's skull had been broken with enormous force, yet the skin remained intact. Kolevatov's wound behind the ear looked like the mark of a blow from a handle of some heavy object. All four, it seemed, had suffered these injuries not in the tent and not on the open slope, but here in the ravine. The bodies were brought to Sverdlovsk on May 12th. The funerals were scheduled for May 14th. The relatives were forbidden from opening the coffins, officially because of severe decomposition after so long in the water. Only Lyudmila Dubinina's father was allowed to look at his daughter. What he saw shocked him so badly that he fainted. After that, the ban became absolute. All 9 hikers were buried at Mikhailovskaya Cemetery in Sverdlovsk. Later, Zolotaryov and Krivonishenko would be reburied separately at Ivanovskaya Cemetery, the most prestigious cemetery in the city, where scientists, artists, and members of the local elite were laid to rest. Why exactly there is a separate question, one we will return to when we talk about Zolotaryov. The mystery was only becoming deeper, but there was a word the investigators kept avoiding, a word that forensic reports, if you read them carefully, seem to be pointing toward. That word was not accident, and it was not nature. When the bodies of the last 4 hikers were pulled from the ravine in May 1959, investigators were faced with a question that still has no clear answers. Many researchers consider it one of the strongest arguments against any simple explanation of the Dyatlov tragedy, and especially against the main official theory that a snow slab avalanche came down on the tent. The question is distance. Look at the map. The tent stood on the slope of Khalatchakhl, about 300 meters below the summit. Tracks led downhill from the tent toward the forest, about 1.5 kilometers, roughly 1 mile down that line. Near the setter, the first 2 bodies, Doroshenko and Krivonishenko, were found. Then, another 70 to 80 meters beyond the setter, in the ravine, the remaining 4 were discovered, along with the platform made from 14 fir trees and a birch. At first, that does not sound like much. On a flat city sidewalk in good weather, you could walk that distance in 15 minutes. But now, picture something completely different. A February night, temperatures around minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 Fahrenheit, and by some estimates as low as minus 40. A cutting wind on the open slope, strong enough to knock you off your feet. Deep snow in places up to 2 meters, swallowing your legs with every step. People running barefoot or in socks, half-dressed, without hats, without gloves, some of them carrying injuries so severe they should have made movement almost impossible. The same 1.5 kilometers, only now that distance stands between life and death. And they do not just cover it, they reach the setter, then 4 of them, Dubinina, Zolotaryov, Thibault Brignol, and Kolevatov, move another 70 meters into the ravine. There they somehow find the strength to cut down 14 young fir trees with a knife. They lay them out into the platform. They make a fire. Someone climbs the setter and breaks branches at the height of 4 to 5 meters. All of this with broken ribs, a crushed skull, injuries that according to the medical report should have caused death within 10 to 20 minutes. Do you believe that? I am not questioning their courage. They were strong, fit, and capable of fighting to the very end. But this is not a question of courage. This is a question of whether those injuries were compatible with any purposeful action at all. Remember what Возрожденный found? Dubinina had 10 broken ribs, massive bleeding into the heart, and according to the report, died within 10 to 20 minutes of the injury. Zolotaryov had 5 broken ribs and severe internal bleeding. Thibaut Brignol had a depressed skull fracture with bleeding into the brain, and Возрожденный stated clearly that he could not have moved on his own. He would have had to be carried or dragged, and yet he was found 70 meters past the setter. Only Kolevatov officially died of hypothermia, though even he had a broken nose, a deformed neck, and a wound behind the ear. Now put all of it together. 9 people, 3 of them with injuries that should have left them where they fell. Somehow travel 1.5 kilometers through deep snow in savage cold. And they leave no drag marks, because the tracks found by the searchers were the tracks of people walking on their own feet. And when they reach the setter, they do not simply collapse. They build a fire, they cut down living trees even though dry wood is available all around them. They build a platform from fir branches laid in careful layers. Someone climbs the setter and breaks off branches from the 4 to 5 meters up. All of this in darkness, in the wind, in brutal cold, without food, without proper clothing, and without any realistic hope of rescue. Where did they find the strength? Supporters of the Avalanche theory say the injuries were not sustained at the tent, but later, perhaps after the group had already reached the ravine, where falling snow struck them again. That at least removes the problem of the distance, but then a different question appears. What they were doing in the ravine in the first place? Why not stay by the fire? And why were only the people in the ravine badly injured and not the others? Supporters of criminal theories answer differently. The injuries were the result of violence, but then how did badly injured people travel that far and build that platform? Were they carried? The tracks say otherwise. And then there is the question almost nobody asks out loud. They moved downhill toward the setter, toward the ravine, toward a place with nothing but trees and wind, but they had a cache, a store of food, firewood, and spare warm clothing, the very things that could have saved their lives. Why did they not go there? Something or someone sent them the other way. Or perhaps they were so completely lost in panic that the cache never entered their minds. But what could strip experienced hikers so completely of the ability to think? This is one of the strongest contradictions in the entire case. It makes it impossible to fully accept any single theory. The distance from the tent to the setter is not just a number in an official report. It is a barrier, one you cannot cross without asking the only question that really matters. What on earth happened there that night? Once the last bodies were recovered from the ravine, the prosecutor's office had to answer a question that only seemed simple. How did the 9 experienced hikers end up dead on a mountainside in February? The investigation had technically begun on February 26, the day the tent was found. The first man in charge was Ivdel prosecutor Vasily Tempalov. By early March, the case had been handed up to Lev Ivanov, the Sverdlovsk regional prosecutor criminalist, and it was now his job to make sense of everything. He spent the next 3 months trying. The first instinct was to look for a human cause. Had someone been out there that night with intent? Investigators considered the possibility of escaped convicts from the nearby Gulags camps. They also looked at the Mansi, the indigenous people of the region, who knew those mountains better than anyone and on whose territory the group had been traveling. Several Mansi men were detained and questioned. They remained calm and cooperative throughout, and many of them had been helping with the search from the beginning. No evidence connected them to the deaths. For the moment, the criminal angle was set aside. We will come back to it later in much more detail. And then testimony began to come in that nobody had expected. Multiple Mansi witnesses questioned separately described the same thing. On the night the group is believed to have died, they had seen fiery spheres in the sky, glowing objects moving silently, hanging above the mountains, changing shape and color. The Mansi drew what they had seen: elongated objects surrounded by halos of light. Those drawings were added to the case file. Later they vanished without a trace. But it was not only the Mansi. On February 17th, another hiking group led by Vladislav Karelin was in the same region. They were woken before dawn by shouts from their companions and watched a huge glowing sphere move across the sky. It was so bright that it looked as if it might fall to the ground at any moment. They watched it for about a minute, and then Karelin added the detail that changes everything. The object changed direction. It had been moving from south to north, then it turned and moved from east to west. A meteorite does not change direction. A weather phenomenon does not either. Whatever Karelin saw, it did not behave like a meteorite or any ordinary natural phenomenon. On March 31st, military sappers working at the pass sent a radiogram to the headquarters. It read:
At 4 a.m., Sentry Masharikov noticed a large fiery ring which moved toward us for 20 minutes, then disappeared behind height 880. Before it vanished, a star appeared from the center of the ring, grew to the size of the moon, and then began to fall downward, separating from the ring. The entire unit observed the phenomenon. We request an explanation and whether it is safe, as in our conditions it creates an alarming impression.
Read that last line again. These were soldiers. They were not asking out of curiosity. They were asking because what they saw disturbed them, not just by its appearance, but by the effect it seemed to have on them. The reply that came back was brief: "You are tired, you imagined it, continue your work." And on February 17th, the newspaper Tagil Worker published a detailed account by Kisel, deputy head of communications at the local mine, describing a glowing sphere the size of the moon moving across the morning sky. Shortly after publication, the editor was officially reprimanded. In the Soviet Union of 1959, some things were simply not supposed to be seen. Ivanov collected every one of these accounts, and as they piled up on his desk, the Mansi drawings, the Karelin sighting, the soldier's radiogram, the newspaper report, he became more and more convinced that something real had been happening in the sky over the Northern Urals that winter, something that might be connected to the death of the 9 hikers. He also noticed one detail that kept returning in different witnesses' accounts. People who had seen the spheres described a strange effect on their minds afterward: confusion, disorientation, a feeling of moving through a daze. If the group had experienced something similar, only far closer, far more intense, then their behavior that night begins to make a different kind of sense. The cut tent, the flight downhill, the inability to make rational decisions, not panic alone, something else. Ivanov wanted to follow that thread. He was not allowed to. He was summoned multiple times to the regional party committee during the investigation. The second secretary gave him direct instructions. Certain theories were not to be pursued. Others were to be shut down. No explanation, just orders. And in 1959, he obeyed. The fiery spheres described by witnesses continued to trouble prosecutor Ivanov. There were too many coincidences, too many details, but if something unusual had really been happening in the sky, could it have left traces not only in the memories of those who saw it, but also on the belongings of the dead? In May 1959, after the bodies of the last 4 had been recovered, Ivanov made a decision that was unusual for that time. He ordered radiological examination of the victims' clothing. In the Soviet Union of the late 1950s, that was not a routine. You did not test the clothing of frozen hikers for radioactivity without a reason. The examination was carried out by Radiological Laboratory of the Sverdlovsk City Sanitary and Epidemiological Station. The victims' clothing was tested, and for comparison, soil samples were taken from the stream where the bodies had been found. The results were unexpected. Elevated levels of radioactive material were found on 3 pieces of clothing. On Lyudmila Dubinina's sweater, the reading was 9,900 disintegrations per minute. On Alexander Kalivatov's sweater and trousers, the readings were 5,000 and 5,600. For comparison, the natural background radiation level at that time was around 1,000 to 1,500 disintegrations per minute, so the levels were elevated but not catastrophically high. And here is an important detail. Dubinina's sweater was not actually hers. It had belonged to Georgy Krivanishchenko. Later, when the belongings were identified, Yuri Yudin confirmed that Lyudmila had taken clothes from her dead companion to keep warm, which means the radioactive contamination may originally have been on Krivanishchenko's clothing. Remember, Krivanishchenko worked at plant number 817 in the closed city of Chelyabinsk 40. This was one of the key sites of the Soviet nuclear industry where weapons-grade plutonium was produced. On September 29, 1957, one of the largest technological disasters of that era took place there, the Kashtim disaster. We did a video about it, don't forget to check it out. An explosion in a tank of radioactive waste caused a massive release of radioactive material. Thousands were exposed and many took part in the cleanup. Krivanishchenko was one of them. His brother, Konstantin, later said that after graduating in 1957, Yura went to work at the Mayak plant where the accident happened. In his view, it was entirely possible that Krivanishchenko had brought radioactive contamination home on his clothes. Alexander Kalivatov also had an unusual background. Before entering UP, he had spent 3 years working in Moscow at one of the institutes under the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, the very ministry that oversaw the Soviet nuclear industry. So Kalivatov, too, could have come into contact with radioactive materials. But there was another possible explanation. Ivanov himself, when ordering the examination, suspected a connection to the fiery spheres. If some kind of test or crash involving a technological object had taken place near the pass, radioactive particles could have settled onto the clothing, especially since all the contaminated items had been found in water. The water may have washed some of the radiation away, which means the original levels could have been higher. When Ivanov received the results, he found himself facing a difficult choice. On one hand, he had evidence that could not simply be ignored. On the other, in those years, anything involving radiation immediately became sensitive, especially especially if it pointed toward military testing. What happened next is recorded only vaguely in the case materials. The protocols from the radiological examination disappeared from the criminal case file. We know about them only through later publications and indirect references. There was one more strange detail. Investigator Karataev, who had worked on the case before Ivanov took over, later recalled that after the autopsies, everyone who had been in contact with the bodies was made to wash themselves in barrels of industrial alcohol. No one explained why. Alcohol is not an effective way to remove radioactive contamination, but in 1959, perhaps it was the only thing they had, or perhaps it was simply the only explanation they could give people without telling them the real reason. In the 1990s, when part of the archives became accessible, independent researchers got hold of some of this information. It turned out that although the radiation levels on the clothing were above natural background, they were not dangerous to human health. Professors Leshakov and Gavrin of St. Petersburg Polytechnic University studied the available materials and concluded that the readings were only slightly elevated and could not have caused radiation sickness. Gavrin added that the testing methods used in 1959 were imperfect. Without modern instruments and an analysis of the isotopes involved, the results could not be considered final. Radiation did not kill them, but it was there. And in a case where evidence kept disappearing, the question is not whether it mattered, but why someone decided it should vanish from the file. On May 28, 1959, prosecutor Lev Ivanov signed the order closing criminal case. The 9 hikers who died on the slope of Khalachakhl officially became victims of an accident. The warning that went down in history was only a few words long. The cause of the hikers' death was a compelling natural force which they were unable to overcome. What exactly was meant by a compelling natural force? An avalanche, a hurricane, a snowstorm, or something else? Was never explained in the document. The investigation gave no answer to the main question: what had forced the group in the middle of the night to cut open their tent and ran out into the freezing dark? The closing order laid out the facts as the authorities chose to present them. The group had been well prepared, had an experienced leader, proper gear, and enough supplies. The search had been carried out, the bodies had been found, the examinations had been completed. Most of the group had died of hypothermia. 3 had died from injuries attributed to a fall or some undefined crushing force. No signs of struggle, no outsiders, and no robbery had been found. The conclusion: accident. But a great deal was left out. The testimony of the Mansi and other witnesses about fiery spheres in the sky was never properly investigated. The radiological reports disappeared from the case file. The soldiers' foot wraps found in the tent and the ravine were never explained. The strange injuries of the final 4, the missing eyes, the missing tongue, the fractured hyoid bone, the symmetrical rib fractures were simply described as the result of a great force, with no attempt to say what that force had actually been. Those who had worked on the case were not satisfied with the result. Investigator Karataev, who had been removed from the case earlier in the spring, later recalled,
"I was called in and told, the case is closed, forget it. I tried to object. I spoke about the strange injuries, about the fact that things did not add up. They told me, your job is to carry out orders, not to reason."
The case was sent to the archive, where it remained for 3 decades. As far as the country was concerned, the Dyatlov Pass tragedy was over, but the story did not end there, not for everyone. 30 years later, when perestroika began and the archives started to open, journalists finally reached Lev Ivanov, the man who had signed that closing order, and he began to talk. In interviews in the late 80s and early 90s, Ivanov said something no one expected to hear. The man who signed the clothing order, the man who had seen every document, every body, every forensic report, said he believed the Dyatlov group had died as a result of some unknown object in the sky. That was why he had collected the fireball testimony so carefully. He believed it was the key to the mystery. That was also why he had been ordered to stop. Absurd by today's standards, of course, he added, but in 1959 he had to obey. The man who wrote the words "compelling natural force" never truly believed in private that the case had been solved. And that phrase turned out to be broad enough to mean almost anything. An avalanche, a storm, ball lightning, secret weapons. Every later researcher filled it with the explanation that seemed most convincing to them. But the central question, what really happened that night on the slope of Halachachal, remained unanswered. And when researchers finally got into the archives, they found something the clothing order had not prepared them for. Not answers, more questions, and now the investigation itself had become part of the mystery. When researchers finally got access to the criminal case, they found something strange almost immediately. The very documents that were supposed to explain the tragedy were full of gaps, contradictions, and missing pieces. Some of the inconsistencies seem small at first. The flashlight found on top of the tent still worked when Slobodin switched it on, even though the tent had supposedly been lying in the snow for almost a month in freezing temperatures. Batteries do not normally last that long. Inside the tent, searchers found a ski pole that had been cut shorter with a knife. Why would an experienced hiker damage equipment they would need to continue the trip? No one has ever explained it. The accounts of the first searchers do not line up either. According to the official version, on the morning of February 27, Koptelov and Ravine found the bodies under the setter and reported back. But a radiogram sent by Slobodin that same morning mentions that 4 people went up, not 2. Who were the other 2? Their names appear nowhere in the official reports. Journalist Yuri, who was present during those events, wrote in his notes that the first body found was not Doroshenko or Krivonishenko, but Dyatlov, and that it was found by someone else entirely. Those people never entered the official timeline. Then there is the evidence that simply disappeared. The Mansi drawings of the fireballs gone. The results of the radiological examination removed from the file with a note saying they were not relevant to the case. The soldiers' foot wraps found at the scene never mentioned in the closing documents, and the diary of Alexander Kalivatov, which he had kept throughout the entire trip and never parted with, vanished without explanation. The cameras raised their own questions. The group had 4: Dyatlov, Krivonishenko, Slobodin, Zolotaryov. All 4 were found in the tent in March and identified. But when Zolotaryov's body was recovered from the ravine in May, there was another camera hanging around his neck, a 5th one. Where did it come from? It was not in the tent inventory. It was not mentioned in any search report from March. It simply appeared on the dead man's neck in May after a month under the snow. Then there are the watches. Dyatlov stopped at 5:31. Slobodin stopped at 8:45. A difference of almost 3 hours. 3 hours the investigation never accounted for. And on Thibaut Brignol's wrist, searchers found not 1 watch, but 2. One showing 8:14, the other 8:39. Why two? Was he carrying one for someone else? No explanation was ever offered. Each of these details on its own can be argued away. A hard winter drained the flashlight slowly, the ski pole was shortened for some practical reason no one recorded, documents get lost, memories differ, but then come the three details that are much harder to dismiss. The first is the date on the case file cover. Printed there in plain text, criminal case opened on February 6, 1959. February 6, 3 weeks before the tent was found and 3 weeks before the first bodies were discovered, the Dyatlov group was still out on the road on February 6. There was no official reason to open a criminal case. Later, that day was crossed out and corrected, changed to February 26 in some places, March 6 in others. Skeptics say it was a simple typo. Roman numerals 2 and 3 look similar. One extra stroke and February becomes March. But here is what makes that explanation almost impossible. The second detail is inside the same case file, a witness interview with Popov, a resident of Vizhai. It was conducted by Captain Chudinov on February 6, 1959, and in that document, the date is not written in numerals, it is written out in full. Interview began on February 6, 1959, concluded on February 6, 1959. There is nothing to misread. The word February is spelled out completely, which means that by February 6, investigators were already interviewing witnesses and collecting information 3 weeks before they were officially supposed to know anything had happened. And then there is the third detail, the hardest one to explain. In the archive of investigator Vladimir Karataev, researcher Oleg Arkhipov found a letter from prosecutor Vasily Tempalov. It is dated February 15, 1959. In it, Tempalov writes that he has been summoned to Sverdlovsk in connection with the death of the tourists and gives Karataev instructions on what to do while he is away. February 15th. 11 days before the tent was found, 12 days before the first body was discovered. How did the prosecutor know the tourists were dead? Who told him? On what basis? The search had barely begun. No one had found anything yet. And still, Tempalov was writing about their death as if they were already an established fact. These three documents, the February 6 case file cover, the Popov interview, and the February 15 letter do not fit comfortably into the official timeline. Together, they create a very specific and very troubling impression that someone knew what had happened on that slope before the searchers found the tent and had already begun preparing for it. Each inconsistency on its own is just a loose thread, but together they pull in the same direction. When documents disappeared from a case file, dates are corrected after the fact, and a prosecutor writes about deaths that have not yet been officially discovered. That means one thing: there was something worth hiding. The only question is, what exactly? Among all the contradictions and mysteries in the Dyatlov case, one figure has always drawn special attention. One of the 9 dead stands apart from the rest. He was almost 15 years older than the others. He joined the group at the last moment. He asked people to call him by a different name, and after his death, tattoos were found on his body that no one who knew him had seen before. Semyon Alexeyevich Zolotaryov. When we picture the Dyatlov group, we usually picture young students, friends, peers, people tied together by the same interest. Zolotaryov did not fit that picture at all. He was 37 years old, a war veteran with 4 military decorations. So how did he end up among them? He was born on February 2nd, 1921. Of the men born that year and sent to the front, only 3% came home. Zolotaryov not only came home, he fought through the entire war in sapper units, took part in the defense of Stalingrad and in crossings of the Dnieper, the Berezina and the Oder, and did it all without a single wound. For a man who spent years in engineering troops where the death rate was devastating, that alone stands out. After the war, he tried to continue a military career, but both schools he applied to were cut back in the post-war reductions. In 1946, he entered the Minsk Institute of Physical Culture. In the mid-1950s, Zolotaryov worked as a hiking instructor in the Altai, then moved to Sverdlovsk region, to the Kaurevka tourist base. By the end of 1958, he had left that job and somehow ended up in Dyatlov's group. How exactly? The group had originally been made up of UP students. A few days before departure, one participant dropped out. Then Zolotaryov appeared. He first approached the leader of another group, Sergei Sogrin, who was preparing for an expedition to the subpolar Urals. Sogrin later recalled,
A middle-aged man came up to me and introduced himself as a hiking instructor. He needed a Category 3 trip for professional qualification. I agreed to take him.
But then it turned out that Dyatlov's road was 10 days shorter, so Zolotaryov switched and asked to join Dyatlov instead. Dyatlov agreed. Lyudmila Dubinina wrote in her diary before the trip.
At first, nobody wanted the Zolotaryov, for he is a stranger. But then we all agreed, because you can't refuse.
That wording is worth noticing. We couldn't refuse. Was someone recommending him? Or was Zolotaryov simply that persuasive? Right before departure, he reportedly told his students, "When we come back, this will shake the world. You'll hear about me. Everyone will." During the expedition, Zolotaryov kept somewhat to himself. He was older and more experienced, but he did not try to take command. Other group members remembered him as a good storyteller who knew many songs. Dubinina, who had doubted him from the beginning, felt that he was a man used to being in charge, even when he was not acting like it. On the night of February 2nd, he ends up in the ravine with Dubinina, Kalivatov, Tibo Brignol, not by the fire with Doroshenko and Krivonishenko. Some researchers see in that choice the instinct of a trained military man: hide, keep low, wait out. Whether that decision might have saved the others under different circumstances, we will never know. But the deepest mysteries began after his body was found. The first is his name. While he was alive, he asked people to call him Alexander. On the memorial plaque at Mikhailovskaya Cemetery, his initials are listed as A.I., even though his passport says Semyon Alexeyevich S.A. In documents from the Institute of Physical Culture, he appears as A.A. It creates the impression of a man who kept blurring his own trail. The second mystery is the tattoos. Forensic expert Boris Возрожденный recorded several on Zolotaryov's body. On the right hand, near the base of the thumb, the name Gena. On the right forearm, the image resembling either a beetroot or a heart, and the letter S. On the left forearm, a 5-pointed star, the letters GSDAE. RMMUAZUAYA. The sequence G plus S plus P equals D, and the number 1921. Daermamauzuya. It has no clear meaning in Russian. It has no clear meaning in any other language. Researchers have tried. It could be abbreviation. It could be a code. No one has ever decoded it. But here's the problem. No one who knew Zolotaryov in life, not relatives, not colleagues, not former students, remembered him having tattoos at all. In photographs where his forearms are visible, the skin looks clear. So where did the tattoos come from? In 2018, his body was exhumed as part of a new investigation. DNA samples were compared with those of living relatives. The results were contradictory. The first analysis showed no match, meaning the body buried as Zolotaryov might not have been his at all. A second, more careful examination confirmed the family connection. How do you explain that gap? A flaw in the method or something else? The question remains open. And then there is the cemetery. Most of the Dyatlov group are buried at Mikhailovskaya cemetery in Sverdlovsk. Zolotaryov and Krivonishenko were buried at Ivanovskaya, the most prestigious cemetery in the city, reserved for scientists, artists, and members of the local elite. In Krivonishenko's case, that can be explained. His father was a senior construction official with connections, but who arranged the same honor for Zolotaryov? He had no relatives in Sverdlovsk, no known connections. He was an outsider who had arrived in the city only shortly before his death. And yet, someone made sure he was buried alongside the city's most distinguished dead. Over the decades, theories about Zolotaryov have multiplied. A KGB agent planted in the group, a criminal living under a false identity, a former Smersh officer who never found his place in peacetime. None of them has ever been proven. But the number of contradictions surrounding one man, the names, tattoos, DNA, the burial is too large to ignore. And that is why Zolotaryov matters so much in this story. If you decide what kind of man he was, you begin to decide what kind of tragedy this was. Around 80 theories have been proposed to explain what happened that night on the slope of Khalachakhl. Some are scientific, some are bizarre. We will go through them, starting with the theories that collapse almost immediately when you compare them with the facts. Let's start with the most exotic. The Yeti theory appeared almost as soon as the case became public. At first glance, it seems to offer something dramatic. Terrible injuries, a remote mountain, and one strange photograph in which some people claim to see a large dark figure against the snow. That image became the main argument for supporters of the theory. But the photograph is extremely poor in quality, damaged by cold and partly overexposed. The figure could just be easily a tree, a shadow, or most likely one of the hikers themselves. No forensic analysis has ever confirmed that it shows a living creature, and in all the decades since, no tracks, no hair, and no biological evidence of any unknown animal have ever been found in that area. Just as important, the injuries do not match an animal attack. Symmetrical rib fractures and depressed skull fracture without damage to the skin are not what claws or teeth do. Some people see it as a mysterious image, but a mysterious image is not the same thing as evidence. The ball lightning theory sounds much more scientific. It seems to explain the fiery sphere that burns on Krivonishenko and Doroshenko and the panic that drove the group out of the tent. According to this version, a ball of lightning approached the tent, triggered panic, and then struck the setter or the ravine, creating a blast wave strong enough to cause internal injuries. But ball lightning is a short-lived and highly localized phenomenon. It cannot move through multiplied places and injure people in different locations at different times. There were also no electrical burns on the bodies, no charring of tissue. none of the signs you would expect from a powerful discharge. The infrasound theory was proposed by American researcher Danny A. Carr. His idea was that wind moving around the shape of Halachachal created infrasonic vibrations, frequencies too low to hear but capable of causing panic, disorientation, and overwhelming dread. It is a real scientific concept, and it would explain why experienced hikers suddenly acted irrationally, but it cannot explain the physical injuries. Infrasound may trigger fear. It does not break ribs. It does not crush a skull. It does not fracture a hyoid bone. The moment you place the autopsy results next to this theory, it stops working. The katabatic wind theory has the same problem. A sudden downward blast of freezing air might explain panic and a rushed escape from the tent, but it does not explain the injuries, and it does not match the tracks. The footprints leading away from the tent were steady and orderly. People being thrown down a slope by hurricane-force wind do not leave neat lines of footprints. Finally, there is a psychotropic theory, the idea that the group consumed or inhaled some substance that caused confusion and irrational behavior. The autopsies found no alcohol and no toxic substances in the victims' bodies, which seems to rule that out. But there is more interesting version of this theory, not ingestion, but outside exposure, smoke, for example, from a burning substance. In that case, internal traces might not remain. I mention that version now only because it will matter later when we look at the one of the more serious theories. All of these explanations have the same weaknesses. Each tries to explain the entire tragedy with one single cause, but the Dyatlov case does not look like a one-cause event. It looks like layers of mystery piled on top of each other, and any theory that hopes to survive has to account for all of them, not just one. Now we come to the theories that do not fall apart quite so easily, or at least not at first. Of all the theories about the Dyatlov's group death, the Avalanche theory is both the most official and the most controversial. It has been endorsed at the state level more than once, yet it is also the theory that raises the most questions among people who study the case seriously. So how did this theory take shape? Back in 1959, when the case was closed, no one spoke openly about an avalanche. The official wording was the vague phrase, a compelling nature force. At the time, an avalanche was not seriously considered as a specific cause. The slope looked too gentle, the snowpack too thin, and the injuries too strange. Experienced hikers and climbers who took part in the search said the same thing. An avalanche on that slope seemed impossible. The avalanche theory was formulated much later, in the 2000s. Its supporters argued that the group was not killed by a classic avalanche, but by a snow slab. A snow slab is a dense layer of snow that forms when the top layer partly melts and then freezes into a hard crust. If there is a weak layer underneath, the whole mass can suddenly break loose and slide. According to this theory, when the Dyatlov group pitched their tent on the slope, they cut into the snow to the level the ground and protect themselves from the wind. By doing that, they weakened the snowpack. Katabatic winds, cold air flowing downhill, kept adding more snow above them. A few hours later, the pressure reached a critical point, and the slab broke loose, sliding down onto the tent. What are the main arguments in the favor of this theory? First, the condition of the tent. When it was found, the back part was covered by snow, but not torn apart. It looked pressed down. Second, the injuries. A snow slab moving at speed can create sudden compression rather than the slow crushing people usually imagine. Researchers who modeled this concluded that such a slab could compress the rib cage enough to cause severe internal trauma while leaving the skin intact. That seems to match what Возрожденный found: broken ribs, a depressed skull fracture, and internal bleeding, but no major external wounds. Third, the group's behavior. They cut open the tent, ran out as they were moved downhill, and built a fire. If they feared another slide, that behavior does make sense. In 2018, at the request of the victims' relatives, prosecutors reopened the case. The review was initiated by a niece of Semyon Zolotaryov, and in 2018-19, officials re-examined the circumstances of the tragedy with the help of modern experts. Then, in July 2020, Andrei Kuryakov, deputy head of the Prosecutor General's office for the Ural Federal District, announced that the group had died as a result of an avalanche. According to his reconstruction, visibility that night was extremely poor. The hikers moved away from the tent and built a fire which burned for about an hour and a half. 2 died of hypothermia almost immediately. The others split into groups. One tried to return to the tent and froze on the slope, while the second group, the one in the ravine, was buried under snow after disturbing the slope there. But almost immediately, a scandal followed. Prosecutor General Igor Krasnov officially reprimanded Kuryakov, saying his statements had not been properly approved and were tied to his dissertation work, not the formal position of the prosecution service. The victims' relatives, including Igor Dyatlov's sister, were refused access to the review materials. A lawyer representing the families called it a blatant violation. Even so, in 2021, the Avalanche theory seemed to gain scientific backing. A team of Swiss researchers led by Johann Gaume and Alexander Puzren published a study in Communication, Earth and Environment. Using computer modeling, they concluded that a small snow slab could indeed have formed on that slope. The hikers cut into the snow, the wind added more weight above them, and after 9.5 to 13.5 hours, the slab may have lost stability. The impact would not have been instantly fatal, but the group, forced out without proper clothing, then died from exposure. An interesting side note, Gaume reportedly found part of the solution while watching Disney's Frozen. He was impressed by how realistically the film modeled moving snow, contacted the studio, gained access to their algorithm, and combined them with his own calculations. Later in 2022, researchers visited the pass, mapped the slope in 3 dimensions, and confirmed that avalanche-prone sections do exist there. They even recorded a small avalanche on a nearby slope, direct proof that such events are possible in that area. At first glance, it sounds like a scientific victory. So why do so many people still doubt it? Because the counter-arguments are serious. The first is the tracks. 8 or 9 sets of footprints led away from the tent downhill. They were visible for approximately 500 meters. These were not tracks of people running in blind panic. They were calm, steady steps. The group was walking, not running. And more importantly, experienced hikers know that when an avalanche comes down, you move diagonally away from the main flow, but the Dyatlov group went straight downhill as if nothing were chasing them. The second problem is the injuries themselves. If a snow slab hit the tent while everyone was sleeping inside, the force should have affected the group more evenly. But 5 members had no major trauma, while 3 had catastrophic internal injuries. A moving wall of snow does not usually choose its victims so selectively. The third problem is the condition of the tent and the objects around it. If a snow slab had come down, it should have shifted the tent, broken poles, and damaged fragile equipment. But the buckets, cooking gear, and a stove were still intact. The skis stuck beside the tent were still standing. The guy lines were not torn. The fourth problem is distance. The setter was 1.5 kilometers from the tent. An avalanche strong enough to cause those injuries could not have carried bodies that far, not on such a gentle slope, and not with so little snow. If the worst injuries happened later in the ravine, then the avalanche does not explain them. The fifth problem is logic. If the group feared another avalanche and was searching for safety, why did they not go to the cache? That was where the food, firewood, and spare clothing were. Instead, they moved into the opposite direction toward the setter where was nothing. The avalanche theory cannot explain that choice. And there is one more question. Have avalanches or snow slabs been recorded there since 1959? In 2022, researchers did film a small avalanche on a nearby slope, so yes, such events are possible, even if rare. But in all the years since, no tourist group has ever been killed by an avalanche on Halachachal itself. It starts to feel like a strangely selective force of nature. The avalanche theory is the most comfortable explanation. It requires no killers, no secrecy, no cover-up, just snow, cold, and bad luck. And maybe that is exactly why so many people in authority prefer it. For many researchers, the avalanche theory left too many questions unanswered, and if nature could not explain everything, then maybe a person could. So let's look at the criminal theories, starting with the simplest one. The first and the most obvious was the theory of escaped prisoners. They were gulag camps near the site of the tragedy. In those years, the fear of escaped convicts was very real for anyone in the taiga. The logic was simple. The hikers ran into escapees, were attacked, stripped of warm clothing, and left to die. But that theory fell apart almost as soon as it was examined. Investigators requested records from all correctional labor institutions in the region. The answer was clear. In January and February of 1959, no escapes had been recorded, not a single one. Then there is the evidence at the scene. If criminals had attacked, they would have taken everything useful, but money, documents, food, alcohol, and warm clothing were still in the tent. Nothing had been touched. Convicts stranded in the taiga without proper gear would have taken at least the boots, but even the boots were still there. And there were no tracks, no ski trail, no footprints that clearly belonged to an outsider. In fresh snow, in winter, in the taiga, that matters. No trace of any attacker was officially recorded. And finally, there were the injuries. Symmetrical broken ribs, a depressed skull fracture without damage to the skin, a fractured hyoid bone, missing eyes and tongue. None of that fits the logic of an ordinary criminal assault. Escaped convicts kill for survival quickly and brutally. These injuries looked different, too unusual for a simple attack. And that is what led some researchers to the next theory, a theory much older and much darker. The first suspicion of the investigation fell on the Mansi. At the time, it seemed like the most natural explanation. Who else in such remote places could pose a danger? The local indigenous hunters knew every slope and every trail. If the hikers had somehow entered a sacred place or violated an important taboo, conflict was at least possible. The interrogations of the Mansi were harsh, but they produced nothing. The suspects denied any involvement, and many of them had also taken part in the search. Officially, the theory was dropped for lack of evidence, but some details did not disappear so easily. During questioning, one Mansi man reportedly let something slip. In the area where the hikers were traveling, there were wild Aztecs who might kill anyone trying to climb a sacred mountain. Later, he took the statement back, but the impression remained. That thread was picked up again many years later. A group of Russian researchers spent years studying this version and pointed to several signs suggesting that a sacred place might have existed near the group's road. Khalachakhl was not the only significant name in the area. Another nearby mountain, Hoy Ekva, can be translated roughly as "stop woman," implying a ban on women entering. Ethnographers have written that the mountain was considered sacred and linked to a high-ranked forest deity. In 1949, a local pilot reported seeing Mansi arriving there from different directions on reindeer, apparently for some kind of ritual gathering. In the 1980s, a hunter claimed that a hunting man told him the tourist had been killed after entering a sacred cave and taking something from it. Even in recent times, people have reported finding signs of sacrifice in that area, reindeer with their throats cut and ribbon tied around them. The group's own timeline also gives researchers something to think about. Remember Zina's diary entry from January 29. The Mansi tracks the trail markings, the symbols she copied onto the next page. This is where those details begin to matter. That same day, the group covered only 5 kilometers and then stopped for a long time. Zina wrote,
Right now, there are 3 of us sitting here, Rustic, Yurka, and me, waiting for the others.
Waiting for whom? The diary does not explain, and among the symbols she copied, there was one drawing that looked different from the others, something like an axe or a hammer, a weapon, a ritual symbol, a random sketch? No one knows. It is possible that part of the group went off to scout the area and accidentally entered a sacred place. For the Mansi, that could have been a serious violation, not just taking objects but even touching certain trees or gathering plants. Ethnographic sources describe a case in 1930s in which a man was killed simply for collecting herbs in a sacred rural area. If some violation really happened on January 29th, the Mansi would have had time to notice it, talk among themselves, and decide what to do. They moved quickly on reindeer, and catching up with the group at the pass would not have been difficult. According to this theory, the attack might have begun with poisonous smoke, for example, smoke made from belladonna, which contains atropine. Such smoke can cause headaches, disorientation, and fear, but it does not kill. The hikers, in panic, cut the tent open and ran out. Then, under threat of weapons, they were forced to leave their things behind and were driven downhill toward the setter. During examination, ring-shaped pressure marks were reportedly found on Igor's and Zina arms and legs, possibly signs that they have been tied. Investigators at that time did in fact ask direct questions about the rope marks on the bodies, which suggests they had some reasons to suspect that possibility. For the Mansi, the cedar is a sacred tree associated with the god of death. Nearby, there was a stream and a fire, all feeding the idea of a sacred place. According to this theory, that is where the group was taken. The first to die were Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko. Both showed signs of struggle. Krivonishenko had bitten off part of his own finger in pain, and both had those strange burns. Part of the group managed to break away and ran uphill, Zina, Rustem, and Igor. They were caught. Their bodies were found on the same line between the setter and the tent. 4 remained below: Luda, Zolotaryov, Kalivatov, and Tibo Brignol. And here, according to this theory, the worst happened. Ludmila's injuries, the missing eyes and tongue, the broken hyoid bone suggesting strangulation, the symmetrical rib fractures. Zolotaryov had the same missing eyes, broken ribs, and wound in the back of his head. At first glance, these injuries seem excessive even for murder, but supporters of this theory argue they look different when viewed through the lens of the ritual practice. One Mansi writer described traditions in which the eyes and tongue of a slaughtered reindeer were treated as especially valuable parts and offered separately. He was not writing about the Dyatlov case, he was writing about Mansi belief. Researchers later drew their own parallels from that. Some also point out that broken ribs and crushing of the upper chest could be interpreted symbolically in certain belief systems, and that the broken cedar branches may have had ritual meanings as well. Among some Finno-Ugric peoples, branches were broken so the soul could rise into the upper world. And then there is the platform made of 14 fir trees in the ravine. It was not a very practical place to rest, and the clothing was laid around the edges rather than wrapped around the bodies. Ethnographers note that among some of Ob-Ugric peoples, raised wooden platforms were used for offerings. In that structure was not a survival shelter, but a ritual platform. The whole picture begins to look very different. Researchers who support this theory also point to a historical precedent. In the 1930s, during the Kazim conflict, Khanty people captured a group of Soviet activists. A shaman reportedly performed a ritual divination to decide their fate, and the captives were killed. Historians describe it as a ritual act. Supporters of the Mansi theory see that event not as a proof, but as a precedent. So why did the investigation abandon this theory? The reasons may have been political. Half a year before the tragedy, an interethnic conflict in Grozny had escalated into mass unrest. Soviet authorities were deeply wary of anything that could trigger ethnic violence. Announcing that tourists had been killed for religious reasons might have had dangerous consequences. It was safer to blame nature, and in those same days, Sverdlovsk was hosting an international speed skating competition with foreign athletes and foreign press in town. Any scandal was highly undesirable. Today, this theory cannot be proven, and it is important to say clearly, modern Mansi people have nothing to do with this tragedy. This is not an accusation. This is an attempt to explain details the official investigation never truly explained. The excessive injuries, the missing eyes and tongue, the platform, the broken branches, and the possible signs of blinding. There is no proof, and at this point there may never be. But the question remains, what explains a broken hyoid bone, missing eyes, a missing tongue, and a platform in a ravine near what may have been a sacred area? A compelling natural force does not explain it, neither does an avalanche. But there was another criminal theory, colder, more calculated, and far more modern. No shamans, no rituals. The KGB, atomic secrets, foreign agents. Among all the criminal theories about the Dyatlov's group death, one stands out for the sheer amount of detail behind it. It was proposed by a writer using the pseudonym Alexei Rakitin. His explanation tries to tie together the radiation on the clothing and unusual biographies of several group members and the strange circumstances of the tragedy. At the center of this theory are three hikers: Georgy Krivonishenko, Alexander Kolevatov, and Semyon Zolotaryov. Krivonishenko worked at plant number 817 in the closed city of Chelyabinsk 40, a major Soviet nuclear facility producing weapons-grade plutonium. In 1957, as we remember, he took part at the cleanup after the Kashtim disaster, one of the largest radiation accidents of that era. Before entering the institute, Kolevatov had spent 3 years working in Moscow at a secret research institute under the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, which oversaw the Soviet nuclear program. And Zolotaryov a decorated war veteran, had graduated after the war from a special faculty at the Minsk Institute of Physical Culture, where instructors for sabotage units were trained under state supervision, according to Rakitin. In Rakitin's view, the radiation found on the clothing of Dubinina and Kalivatov could not have appeared there by chance. Dubinina's sweater had belonged to Krivanishchenko, which means the contamination likely originated with him. The level recorded by the examination was not high enough to kill, but it was high enough to attract attention. High enough, Rakitin argues, for specialists to identify what kind of secret facility it came from. From there, he builds his central idea. Rakitin suggests that these three men may have been involved in what intelligence services call a controlled delivery, allowing sensitive material to reach the enemy under state supervision in order to expose, monitor, or manipulate an operation. In this case, the bait would have been radioactive material linked to a secret Soviet nuclear site. According to this theory, Krivanishchenko carried contaminated clothing out of the plant as proof that he worked at the closed nuclear facility. Through a double agent, Western intelligence allegedly received word that he was ready to cooperate. A meeting was arranged in the Northern Urals, and a hiking expedition provided perfect cover for both sides. Zolotaryov's role in this version was to document the meeting. Kalivatov was there as support. And that is where one of the most important details in the theory appears. When Zolotaryov's body was found in May, there was a fifth camera hanging around his neck, the one that had not appeared in the inventory of the items recovered from the tent. All the other cameras had been left behind. Zolotaryov had taken his with him into the night. According to Rakitin, this was the special camera meant to photograph the agents. The other camera found in the tent served as cover, and during the entire expedition, Zolotaryov had not taken a single picture with it. Coincidence? Or a man quietly carrying out a specific task? In this reading, the Dyatlov group became the perfect cover story without even realizing it. Respectable students from good families, experienced hikers, a trip dedicated to the party congress. Who would suspect that such a group might include people involved in a secret operation? The meeting, according to Rakitin, took place on the evening of February 1st on the slope of Khalachakhl, but something went wrong. Perhaps the foreign agents suspected a trap. Perhaps one of the hikers tried to photograph them. Whatever happened, the agents decided to eliminate all the witnesses. Under threat of weapons, the hikers were forced out of the tent. Objects found near the entrance looked to supporters of this theory as though they had been thrown aside rather than left voluntarily. Then there is a heel print. Among the tracks leading away from the tent, searchers reportedly found one print from a shoe with a heel. None of 9 hikers wore shoes like that. A surviving photograph is said to show this print. No one ever identified it. Then there is Kalivatov's knife. Near the tent, the knife and a sheath from his belt were found in the snow. In the taiga, a knife is a survival tool. You do not part with it lightly. The sheath was found in March. The knife itself turned up only in May after the snow melted. Rakitin reads this is another sign that someone forced the group to abandon essential gear. Part of the group, in his reconstruction, tried to resist. Slobodin may have gone for the attackers, which would explain his battered knuckles, the crack in his skull, and the marks on his shin that look consistent with a trip or a sweep during a fight. By the setter, the situation became even darker. The gray foam recorded coming from Doroshenko's mouth is interpreted in this theory as a sign of an acute pulmonary edema caused by severe chest trauma. Doroshenko was young, fit, and had recently passed a military medical examination. In Rakitin's view, this was not simply hypothermia, it was violence. Thibaut Brignol and Zolotaryov, according to this version, managed to break away and take Dubinina and Kalivatov with them into the ravine, but they were found there anyway. Meanwhile, the tent was being searched. 2 cameras, which Rakitin believed belonged to Thibaut Brignol and Kolmogorova, were missing from the recovered items. He argues that the killers took them, mistaking them for Zolotaryov's special camera. The shortened ski pole becomes one of the most suspicious details, something no experienced hiker would normally do to their own equipment, but perhaps something an outsider might do without understanding its importance. In Rakitin's reading, the radiation on the clothing is not a side detail, it is the reason the entire operation existed, and it is also why, he argues, the examination results were later quietly removed from the case file. And then there is one more point, a detail even some skeptics find difficult to ignore. On July 6, 1959, just a few months after the death, 3 of the 5 deputy chairmen of the KGB lost their positions on the same day. Rakitin links these removals to the failure of the operation. If a controlled delivery had ended with the 9 people dead and the whole thing exposed, someone at the top would have paid for it. There is no documentary proof of that connection, but the timing is striking. Still, there are serious problems with this theory. If the operation was truly that secret and that professionally planned, why involve a group of untrained students? Zolotaryov may have been the only professional among them. The others were ordinary young people who had no idea what they might have been caught up in. There is also not a single document proving that foreign agents were actually operating in the area at that time. No intercepted messages, no archival records, no confessions. Rakitin's theory explains many of available clues with impressive precision, but it is still built on assumption that has never been documented. And finally, there is the most uncomfortable question of all. Would professional intelligence operative really kill 9 tourists in the middle of the Ural Taiga, knowing they would be searched for, knowing the disappearance would trigger an investigation, knowing every detail would be examined? That is an enormous risk to take just to eliminate witnesses to a meeting that was supposed to look accidental in the first place. Rakitin's theory is the most fully developed of all the criminal explanations, but there are no perfect theories in this case. What it really does is force you to consider a grim possibility. What if 9 young people became innocent victims of a larger game they never even knew they were part of? If Rakitin is right, even partially right, then 9 students went into the taiga not knowing they were covered for something else entirely. They did not choose this. They were chosen, and they paid with it with their own lives. But before we move on to the final and perhaps most radical theory, we need to deal with one more group of explanations. These theories do not accuse specific people. They point instead to something else, something that happened over the pass that night, something without a human face but still made by human hands. Rockets, tests, toxic fuel, a technological disaster. We have already talked about the fireballs seen over the Northern Urals that winter. Now, let's look at them from a different angle. What if they were not an anomaly and not UFOs, but the result of a Soviet military activity? In the late 1950s were the height of the Cold War and the space race. In those years, the sky over the Urals was in effect a testing ground. Ballistic missile launches, military exercises, secret programs, all of it was happening regularly, and the public knew almost nothing about it. Supporters of the technological theory point to specific dates. On February 17th, the day Karelian's group saw a glowing sphere, launches of R-7 intercontinental ballistic missiles really were taking place. That is not speculation, it is a documented fact. Were there launches on the night of February 1st to 2nd, the very night the Dyatlov group died? That is where things become more complicated. Researcher Skibinsky spent years digging through archives and put forward a version centered on the R-12, a liquid-fueled medium-range ballistic missile. According to his reconstruction, the launch site may have been near the settlement of Polarny, and the missile's theoretical flight path could have passed over the area of the pass. So how exactly could that have killed the hikers? The R-12 used nitric acid as an oxidizer, a colorless, highly corrosive liquid. Nitric acid fumes can cause burning in the eyes, coughing, suffocation, and pulmonary edema. If it gets onto the skin, it can cause chemical burns. In the event of a failed launch or the breakup of a missile stage, the area below could have been covered by an invisible toxic cloud. Picture the scene. The hikers are in the tent, getting ready to sleep. Suddenly, a bright flash, a rising roar, and within seconds, suffocation. Their eyes begin to burn. Panic sets in. They slash open the tent and run outside, not because they are too slow to unbutton the entrance, but because every second inside now feels deadly. They ran downhill away from the source. That would explain the cut tent, the half-dressed bodies, and the complete collapse of rational behavior in the experienced group. The technological theory also tries to explain several other strange details. The orange tint described on some of the bodies could be interpreted as a possible sign of chemical exposure. The gray foam at Doroshenko's mouth could point to pulmonary edema developing rapidly after inhalation of toxic fumes. Even the strange reports of confusion and disorientation from people who saw the fireballs fit this picture. There is also the argument that nitric acid could have altered the surface of the snow, which might explain why some of the tracks looked unusual to searchers. And if something like that really happened, there would have been every reason to hide it. Admitting that a military accident had killed 9 civilians in the Urals would have been a political disaster. Much easier to write a compelling natural force and close the case. But this theory has serious weaknesses too. No debris was found at the scene, no rocket fragments, no crater, no obvious traces of fire. A missile could, in theory, have passed overhead and affected the group through a toxic cloud alone, but then it becomes harder to explain why only this group was affected and why no one else in the region reported similar physical symptoms. Then there is the radiation. If the cause had been some nuclear or radioactive component of a missile, the clothing of all the victims should have shown contamination, not just a few items belonging to specific individuals. That uneven pattern does not fit well with the idea of exposure from above. And most importantly, no one has ever found archival proof that any launch, accident, or military test took place near Dyatlov Pass on the night of February 2, 1959. That could mean none took place, or it could mean the records were destroyed. Given everything else we know about this case, the second possibility cannot be ruled out. The technological theory is one of the more logical ones. It explains fireballs, the group's behavior, and some of the strange physical details reported after the bodies were found, but it still rests on missing documents and on a secret accident that was never officially acknowledged. And now we come to a theory that challenges almost everything, including the tent itself. Among all the people who studied the Dyatlov Pass tragedy, Yuri Kuntsevich stands apart. He did not just read documents and build theories. He founded the Dyatlov Group Memorial Foundation and spent decades collecting every possible piece of this story. His version is radically different from all the others. Kuntsevich believed that the place where the tent was found was not the group's real campsite at all. In his view, the group had pitched camp somewhere else entirely, in the forest, near the stream, in the very place where the platform and the bodies of the last 4 were later found. That would have been the logical choice for an experienced leader. The forest gives shelter from the wind, and there is water and firewood nearby. And according to Kuntsevich, that is where the tragedy actually happened. The tent on the slope was put there later by people trying to cover their tracks. Kuntsevich pointed to several strong arguments in support of this theory. The first was the flashlight found on the top of the tent. When searchers discovered it on February 26, it still worked, but the tent had supposedly lain on that slope for almost a month in freezing weather under snow and wind. The batteries should not have held a charge that long, which suggests the flashlight was placed there shortly before the tent was found, after the tragedy, when the tent was being moved. The second point was helicopter traces. Searchers said that on top of the pass where a helicopter could have landed, there seemed to be marks from rudder wash, snow scattered in a way that stood out clearly. If military personnel had reached the site before the official search began, then they may have had time to rearrange the scene. The third argument was perhaps the most unexpected and also the most technical. Kuntsevich and his colleagues focused on 2 images that investigator Ivanov had described as the group's last photographs, the one supposedly showing the hikers putting up the tent on the slope. In 2011, when the images were digitized and uploaded online, independent researchers ran them through forensic image analysis software. These were not conspiracy theorists looking for something to find. They were people trying to understand what the photographs actually showed, and what they found was troubling. The software identified areas where the images appeared to have been altered. Blackened sections in the lower right and upper left corners that looked like attempts to paint over outside objects. In one image, part of the background may have been covered up, possibly trees. In the other, part of the tourist's body and an object near his feet were obscured, an object that may have matched part of the pipe later found in the ravine. The negatives of those photographs, incidentally, disappeared from the case file. Researchers traced the path of the digital copies and found signs that the images had been processed and their metadata changed before publication. All of that suggests that the photos may have been edited back in 1959, specifically to hide the real place where they were taken. If trees were visible in the originals, then the tent was not standing on a bare open slope at all, but in the forest exactly where Kuntsevich believed the real camp had been. The fourth argument was the platform in the ravine itself. If the group had come down from the slope, why would they then cut 14 young fir trees and build a complicated structure 70 meters from the fire? From a survival point of view, that makes little sense. But if that had been their real campsite from the beginning, then it becomes logical. They built the platform so they would not have to sleep directly on the snow, started a fire there, and that is where the disaster struck. The fifth point was the strange dates in the case file, the same ones we examined earlier. The case opened on February 6, Stempalov's letter dated February 15th referred to the death of the tourists before any bodies had been found. For Kuntsevich, those documents were not bureaucratic errors. They were proof that the authorities knew about the tragedy well before the official search began. They knew, and they were already preparing to manage what came next. According to Kuntsevich reconstruction, events unfolded like this. The group set up camp in the forest near the stream. Then a technological disaster occurred, perhaps a fallen rocket or a weapons test, killing some of them immediately and badly injuring the others. Military personnel arrived first. In order to hide a secret object or the fact of a secret test, they staged the appearance of an ordinary tragedy. They moved the tent onto the slope, cut it open to create the impression of a panicked escape, and scattered the bodies in different places to imitate a desperate attempt at survival. The real camp, the platform in the ravine, was then passed off as the place where the injured had tried to save themselves. Kuntsevich often said that investigator Lev Ivanov had hinted to him that this was close to the truth, and there is one exchange that is very hard to forget. Yuri Yudin, the only one who came home, remembered Ivanov once saying to him,
Yurka, you would have been the 10th. God kept you away. They would have cleaned you up too.
What does clean up mean? Removed as an unwanted witness. Critics of Kuntsevich's theory point to its biggest weakness, the sheer difficulty of staging all of this. Traces of such a move should have remained: ski tracks, footprints, signs of disturbance in the snow around the tent, but searchers found none. And why would the military go to the trouble of such a complex deception when it would have been easier simply to announce that the group died from the elements and leave everything where it was? Supporters answer that this is, in a sense, exactly what happened. They did declare a compelling natural force. The staging, they argue, was needed to explain why the bodies were found in different places and why the injuries did not fit an avalanche. And if military personnel arrived by helicopter before the official search began, they could have covered their tracks in the snow simply by leaving the same way they came. Kuntsevich died in 2021, taking many details with him that he never had time to publish, but his theory did not die with him. The photograph analysis carried out in the 21st century suggests that the suppression of this story may have begun not after the tragedy, but during the investigation itself, when parts of the images were altered to hide whatever might point to the truth. If the photographs were altered, then the question is no longer what happened on the pass. The question is who decided to hide it and how early they started. I have spent a long time with this case. I have read original Russian materials that most English-speaking viewers never get access to. And after all of that, this is where I stand. I think the avalanche theory is possible. The Swiss researchers show that clearly. I do not dismiss it because it's physically impossible. I remain unconvinced because to me it still leaves too much unexplained at once. The injuries, behavior, missing documents, and the strange dates in the case file. In other words, the problem is not that the avalanche theory cannot work. The problem is that it does not fully account for the whole picture. And if this really was nothing more than a tragic accident, a rare snow event, panic in the dark, the worst injuries coming later in the ravine, the radiation coming from Krivonishinsko's work, the fireballs being unrelated military activity, then we still have to face the same questions. Why is the date on the cover February 6? Why is Stempalov's letter dated February 15th? Why did the Mansi drawings and the radiological records disappear? Why did the flashlight still work after a month in the cold? Why was there a bitten off finger in Krivonishinka's mouth and no tongue in Dubinina? That is why I cannot accept the avalanche as a complete answer. Those questions still remain. And no one carried them longer than Yuri Yudin. He was the only one who came home alive. He left the road on January 28, 1959, because of pain in his leg, and watched as his friends disappeared into the taiga. He never saw them again. For the rest of his life, he searched for the truth. He returned to the pass. He took part in investigations. He gave interviews. He kept demanding answers. He did not give up. Yuri Yudin died in 2013. There were still 7 years left before the official Avalanche statement. He did not live to hear even that dry, disputed answer. Shortly before his death, he said, "If I could ask God only one question, I would ask, what happened to my friends that night?" He lived for 54 years with a question no one answered. Now that question belongs to us. Their deaths were a tragedy. The mystery around them came later. And over time, that mystery became a mirror. The conspiracy-minded see a cover-up. The romantic sees heroism. The skeptic sees chance. The cynic sees the interest of power. But behind all those reflections were 9 real people. Maybe the truth about Dyatlov Pass will never be found. Maybe it still exists in archives that remain closed. Maybe someone knew and stayed silent. Or maybe the final truth is that this story will always remain unfinished. And perhaps that is why we keep returning to it. To search, to doubt, to argue, to build theories. And to remember the 9 young people who went on a hike and never came back.